and welcome to the Vocal Fries Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Megan Figueroa.
And I'm Carrie Gillen.
Hey there.
Hey, end of the month.
End of the month, and you are so close to being out of this fucking country.
I know. Hopefully. The plan is still a month away, so hopefully.
Yeah.
Because I don't know if you've noticed, but feels like we've gone full fash.
Yeah, full fash. Yeah, that's... Yep, hashtag full fash. Absolutely.
Oh, God, I shouldn't be laughing, but I don't know what else to do.
No, it's the laughing that stops the crying. It's... I know. Yeah, it's not actually funny. It's horrifying and scary. And
truly horrifying, yeah.
Everyone outside of the States, like, watching this dumpster fire, like, I don't know. Hello from within it, and I feel so bad. Like, as an American, I'm like, I'm sorry we're doing this to, like, the world and to just humanity.
Yeah, that's true. If it was just going to affect basically Americans, it would be different. But this is going to have such wide-reaching effects. I mean, other countries have obviously gone through this either before or, more recently. So, like Hungary, Brazil.
Yeah.
The United States is not alone.
Right. No. But it does not make me feel better.
No, it shouldn't. It should be terrifying that this is spreading across the world. Yeah. Yeah, it's... I mean, everyone talks about 2020 being just the worst year. And, of course, like, the whole thing where when something bad happens, it feels worse when you're already in it. So, like, things keep piling on and everything feels like just absolute shit. Part of that just happened a couple days ago. T'Challa, Black Panther, Chadwick Boseman, passed away. And I wanted to read something to you, Carrie, because I've been reading all these lovely things about him, obviously, because he was a lovely person. But it's language related. Mm-hmm. So you're not going to be surprised by this, but the producers or whoever wanted to give T'Challa an European or American accent. Oh my God. That makes no sense in the context of the story.
So that's what he said. So I wanted to make sure that he didn't speak like, well, at one time they were thinking he'd have a European accent or American accent. I said that would not be fine because if we did that, that would be saying that they had been colonized. And that was something that I wanted to make sure happened, which is he's saying he didn't want them, him to have an American or European accent, that we stuck to that in the character. And he also said, if I speak with a British accent, what's going to happen when I go home? It felt to me like a deal breaker. I was like, no, this is such an important factor that if we lose this right now, what else are we going to throw away for the sake of making people feel comfortable? And it's so true. And this really good point too. Sorry, there's so many good quotes about this that he said. So he said, if I did that, spoke with that accent, I would be conveying a white supremacist idea of what being educated is and what being royal or presidential is, because it's not just about him running around fighting. He's the ruler of a nation. And if he's the ruler of a nation, he has to speak to his people. He has to galvanize his people. And there's no way I could speak to my people who have never been conquered by Europeans with a European voice.
Yes, agreed.
Just like, absolutely. And of course, I'm not surprised that he was thinking about this. I think that more non-Black people need to be thinking about these kind of things. Like, and this is really, it ties into our episode today too. Like, not enough just people in general are thinking about how the lack of linguistic diversity that many people face. So the fact that there's a lot of, a lot of people don't have access to many different accents or whatever, that's actually a big problem, and a problem that people aren't really thinking about as a problem.
What's interesting about this case is that it's also just not realistic to have him have a British or American accent. Like, the people with those kinds of accents in Africa are white people in, say, South Africa. And even there, their accents are very different. They're still different than the European ones. Afrikaans and Dutch are different, and the English spoken in South Africa is different from the English spoken in the UK. So it just doesn't make any sense. So, like, a lot of people are all about realism until you do this, until you want, like, a Black person to have an African accent. Then suddenly it's, whoa, too far.
Oh yeah, no, he was right to call out, like, what else are we going to do for the sake of basically white people's comfort?
Right, because that's all it is just making, because we're more familiar with those accents, right. Most white people, and so yeah, it's for our comfort. No.
Exactly. No, absolutely. And you're right, it totally another point is that it just doesn't make sense given linguistic variation and like migration and any of that stuff either. So like one, it's just plain out or just plain wrong. Like in this, even though Wakanda isn't real, it doesn't, it would never make sense for Wakanda. But also like in the real world, it wouldn't make sense given variation and migration and all of that. Yeah, no, it's making me think of, the interview we did for this episode. And it's like, we really need to start thinking about the type of voices that we encounter. I used to be really guilty of this. I think I've said it multiple times where I have a hard time with shows, like British shows, that I have to use subtitles.
Well, that's not a bad thing.
No, I'm just not trained to, I just didn't spend that much time with it. I'm getting better because I watch more and more. But at the beginning, it's like, I absolutely needed subtitles. And now it's like, I miss a few words here and there because they're, lexical items are different. I'm like, what? Yeah. Reiterating something that we've said so many times, it's like, get exposure to different people and accents and languages and whatever, because I don't know. I think it's just, we need to stop putting the onus on people that we've said their accents are marginalized for whatever reason. Thinking specifically here, like accent reduction stuff, we're always talking about like Asian accents, right? Like there's these specific accents that we know people are talking about when they say, accent reduction classes, that's who they're targeting.
Yes, it's so important to represent many more accents than we have been. And also, if you're making a certain kind of white person comfortable, they're still not going to watch that movie.
It's true. Yeah.
If they're so racist they can't stand to listen to an African accent, then I don't think they're really going to watch Black Panther.
I was going to say, yeah, what racists are watching Black Panther? Like, surely there's just too many black people on screen for them in the first place, no matter how they sound.
Like, maybe you'd get a small sliver of people who are, like, somewhat racist, but not totally racist, but I still don't think it's worth trying to get that tiny sliver of people.
Right.
And anyway,
yeah.
it's a great movie and people love it. So.
Exactly. And it's just like, I don't know, make racists uncomfortable and, like, let's stop catering to racist white people. Whether it's like they're just, waving a MAGA flag, or if they're more undercover than that, we need to really stop catering to them. Well, anyway, I think that's a really important thing. I mean, that Chadwick gave, the world that he fought for T'Challa in Black Panther. And I'm not surprised to hear that they wanted to give the character a European or American accent. But I'm glad that he was like, this is a deal breaker.
Yeah, so. I agree. And I was very sad because he's the exact same age as me.
I know.
So it makes it even... hits you a little harder. Anyway.
No, absolutely. Yeah, no, it's very sad. Shall we get to the interview? It's a good one. It's really good. And it's like, I was really excited to have a psychologist. We got to talk about things that, a little bit differently than we talk about with linguists, but yet very related, obviously, to linguistics and linguistic diversity.
I mean, yes, she's a psychologist, but really most of what she said is exactly what any linguist would say. So, like, interdisciplinary power.
Well, I know, and I just have to, like, say that it's something to celebrate, because not all psychologists are, speaking or, feel the same way about language as linguists do. There is definitely a problem in the field.
Yes, there is a problem in the field.
But anyway.
There is a big, big problem in the field.
But our guest is a good one, so.
It's very good. And actually, we should thank Ray Belli for introducing us, because he was the one who suggested that we talk to her.
Yeah.
He's from Words for Granted, and which is another podcast you should check out if you haven't yet.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much. We're very grateful.
Yes, thank you.
Like this show and want to make your own? Let me tell you about Anchor. It's free, and they have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And now you can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Today we have Dr. Catherine D. Kinsler, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Chicago. Her research sits at the intersection of developmental and social psychology, and her work focuses on the origins of prejudice and in-group/out-group thinking, with an emphasis on understanding how language and accent mark social groups. She also has a new book that just came out called How You Say It, Why You Talk the Way You Do, and What It Says About You. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Hi.
Thanks for being here. I'm excited that we haven't had a psychologist on.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of, psychologists and linguists should talk more, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love this opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, my emphasis in my PhD was psycholinguistics, so developmental psycholinguistics. So I'm so happy to talk with another person who works with kids.
Awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And actually, we've talked about one of your studies before on the podcast, because we were talking about Southern American English.
Oh, great.
Yeah. We'll get to that later, though.
Happy to talk about it. Sounds great.
Yeah.
So first question, why did you want to write this book?
It actually relates to the topic of psychologists and linguists talking more. So, as you said, my research is in social and developmental psychology. And in psychology, there's so much work on in-group and out-group thinking and prejudice and intergroup cognition. And, the bottom line is that it's really easy to see social group divisions, which isn't surprising to any researcher or any human living on the planet. Gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, and so forth, that there are so many different ways in which we divide ourselves into groups. But one thing that seems completely critical for how we think about ourselves and how we think about each other, who we connect with, and whom we might be prejudiced against is language. So this is really underrepresented a lot in research by social psychologists who study human groups. And I really wanted to write a book that situated psychology research, but within a broader field. And so, of course, if you look at linguistics, sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics, you can look at anthropology, other neighboring fields in the social sciences. Language is just such a critical feature of our social lives. And so I really wanted to talk across disciplines.
You mentioned in your foreword about having a child and kind of like what we always think about what is the world we're going to leave our children, but we don't really talk about the linguistic world that we're creating for them, and that's really important.
Yeah, and I think that for kids, they're these remarkable linguistic creatures who are just amazing at learning language or languages early in life. At the same time, they're also going to learn, linguistic prejudices, and that all these stereotypes and attitudes that we have as adults about languages are going to be absorbed by our kids. And so it's really important to think about that too.
We definitely don't talk enough about or think enough about the prejudices that we're passing on. We think about it, I think, more about, we're not bringing up our children in quite as racist a way, but if we're still embedding the racism in the language, which we totally do, then it is still trickling down to them.
And kids are smart, kids are picking up on, as you said, structures of racism at different levels. They're picking up on subtle prejudices that we convey verbally or non-verbally. They're learning the attitudes that adults have.
Definitely. So what are in-groups and out-groups?
So I think about in-groups and out-groups as the idea that there might be people who you see as being similar to you or similar to people around you, and that's your in-group. And it's not necessarily bad. In many ways, we're drawn to people who are like us. We're drawn to connect with others. We're an extremely social species, and it would be impossible to live by yourself without this group of people supporting you. At the same time, it's also really easy for us to start to draw lines in the sand and start to see other people as being different from us. And that's where you can start to see a lot of stereotypes and prejudice developing.
And did you also say intergroup cognition?
Yeah.
What is that?
So it's how we think about different groups. So I'm interested in what my field calls social cognition. And so it's your thinking about social life. And so it's not just describing patterns of behavior, but it's also thinking about the mental states you might have. So how do you represent in groups and out groups? How do you represent a person you just met as, being like you or not? Or what kinds of thinking would you engage in when you're thinking about somebody who's like you versus thinking about somebody who's not like you? Maybe you'd think about their mind or their mental states in different ways, or their emotions in different ways, or their patterns of thought in different ways. And so I think that it's really about your cognition, but applied to social life.
I've heard a lot of people say that humans are just wired to find patterns and to look for patterns. And I feel like it's a too simplistic way of looking at what we do with the social aspect of all this.
Well, where this starts out in childhood, a lot of that is this idea of this basic cognitive skills being applied to the social world. So when I think about basic cognitive skills, I often think about categorization, which is really helpful and useful. So if you learn one thing and then you apply it to some new instantiation or a slightly different version of that same thing, and if every single time you encountered an object or a person or a situation, if you couldn't draw on your past experiences, you'd be really, really slow to act on anything. And so in some ways, categorization is extremely helpful and cognitively efficient. But then, of course, we apply categorization to the social world. And sometimes that's really useful if you're inferring that two people are like each other in some way, and you might make some inference about them that's helpful to engage with them. But other times it can be really nefarious, and you can think, oh, these two people are the same because they're a member of the same group. And then you might have some negative stereotype that you apply to them that has nothing to do with them as an individual.
So when are children picking up these biases?
So kids are starting to categorize things really from infancy. So in some of my research, I find that children, our studies were with babies around a year of age, although presumably this might exist before then too. But, within the first year of life, babies are starting to think that two people who are similar in some way are similar in other ways too. So it's kind of like a rudimentary thinking about social groups. And often I study language. So say babies start to think, well, if two people speak the same language, they might be more likely to say eat the same foods and like to share the same foods, or they might be more likely to engage in some sort of a positive interaction than two people who speak in two different languages. So in that sense, I think the categories are starting soon, but then the prejudice is what happens when adults often layer something on top of those categories. And so it's somewhat variable. I would say over the first 5 years of life, kids are starting to learn more about whether society is seeing some categories as being higher status or more representative or preferred in some way. And then by the time that they're in elementary school, so over the first 10 years of life, they're learning tons of stereotypes and prejudiced attitudes that adults have, and they start to pick up on this.
Is it hard for them to unlearn it? Or is it easier for them to unlearn it than an adult?
My best guess is that it's easier for them to unlearn it than an adult. At the same time, this is a really important and dynamic area of research where people are really trying to figure out what are the ways that they can unlearn a stereotype or a prejudice that started to develop. Now, one way that I think we can say it's not quite as clear as unlearn something, but I think in some senses you might start to get the beginnings of a prejudiced attitude, and it might not be as deep or as entrenched as an adult's. And so I do think there's still some malleability in early childhood. And that's really important to think about.
Yeah, it reminds me of my mom told me that before I entered school, when I said that something like there's the black girl or black boy, I meant hair color. So I was just picking out hair color when I said something like that. I hadn't yet learned, that when people say that, they usually mean skin color.
And I think this is, there's been a long history of white parents in the U.S. often endorsing some sort of belief about colorblind parenting. So it's the idea that you just don't talk about race, right? And then it won't exist. And unfortunately, we live in a society with a lot of racist attitudes that are out there. And so kids are picking up on those, whether or not parents talk about them. So from that point of view, it's actually really important for parents to try to counteract the sorts of negative attitudes that their kids could be learning. But I think your example is really is a really important one, that kids are noticing stuff in their environment. They could be talking about someone's skin color, their hair color, their way of dressing, whatever it is. And I think when parents treat race as taboo, which some parents do, that some parents will hear a kid say something like that, just commenting on the color of different people, which isn't necessarily negative if a kid is just, noticing things in their environment, that when parents react in a very uncomfortable way about race, even if it was a relatively innocent comment made by a very small child, that kids can then pick up on that, and then a discomfort in thinking about race and, thinking about it as taboo, and that can really lead to further negative attitudes.
So thinking about negative attitudes towards language in particular, is there an equivalent that parents are doing with children where they're like, let's not talk about the differences in language?
So I actually don't even think we're there yet. And so, I think that one of the reasons why I wrote this book is that I think we are dramatically under-aware of the amount of linguistic prejudice in society. And I think that's true kind of at all levels of society, structurally, if you look at the legal system, if you look just societal or cultural values, and if you think about what parents are teaching their kids. So to give just one example, if I have parents bring their kids into my lab and say, imagine there's a 5-year-old white child who comes into the lab, say with her mom, and at this age, you often start to see early race-based preferences being expressed. So like a white kid in the US might say that she likes other white kids, or even specifically other white girls. And parents are very distressed when they see their child do this, which is actually probably a good thing, that as a society, we need to really grapple with where are these attitudes coming from and what can we do to address them. So parents are very uncomfortable if their children express a race-based attitude, or at least the parents that I tend to test in a university town. Now, when a child says, the same 5-year-old child says that she likes other kids who speak in a Native American sounding accent, somebody who speaks in a familiar way, as opposed to somebody who speaks in a less familiar accent to that child, parents just aren't bothered by it. It's and some parents even see it as a positive thing, like such as, oh, my kid's really good at learning languages. And so I think just an awareness of the idea that linguistic biases can be really problematic. We're almost not even so aware of it so as to have discomfort expressing the awareness.
So true.
Yeah, no, I'm like sitting with that for a second because it's so true. I'm even thinking like my gut instinct is like, why would that be problematic? And I'm a linguist and I talk about this all the time, like we really you're right, we haven't gotten there. Like parents, just everyone, we're not there yet.
One of the things you talk about in this book is how language can unite us and how language can divide us. So how does language do both of these things?
So it's back to that question about in-groups and out-groups really basically. So we are attracted to people who are like us. And of course, with language, it's this fascinating reciprocal relationship, right? That we like people who are like us. And by being together, our language can change and reflect each other. And so a new group of people can form their own social identity, and often that's coupled with a linguistic identity. And so there can be something really positive and meaningful about connecting with people who share a similar culture, a similar aspirations, similar group identity, and often there's a lot of linguistic commonalities that go along with that. At the same time, you see the flip side and how easy it is to see somebody who doesn't speak like you as being somebody who's really different from you. And then even being prejudiced against somebody based on their way of speaking, thinking that they don't speak in a way that's as good as you, though of course linguists will say that all ways of speaking are great ways of speaking, that there's no language that's better than other language at expressing human thought.
How do shibboleths work to do this? And it's so funny because the word shibboleth, am I saying it right? And this is perfect.
Yeah.
Going into
it's perfect, right? Because in my story, you would be murdered if you were saying it incorrectly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Tell me about this. How do they work?
Yeah. So, shibboleth is the ancient biblical story of the Gileadites and the Ephraimites, and I hope I'm saying them correctly. I believe it goes something like the Gileadites captured the fords of the Jordan, and whenever an Ephraimite came over, they said, "Can you say shibboleth?" And if they said sibboleth, it would suggest that they couldn't pronounce the word correctly, and it was a way to detect somebody who was an infiltrator to their group. Now, of course, the bigger picture idea here is that we are much better at learning languages as children than as adults. And in particular, learning a non-native phonology is incredibly difficult as an adult, as anybody who's tried to take, a foreign language class in high school or college knows. It's really hard. Whereas children can master a native sounding accent quite quickly. And so the idea is that by using a word like shibboleth that could detect somebody who has a native ear versus not, it was a way to figure out who the infiltrators were.
And we do that all the time today.
Yeah, I think we do it all the time today. Now, we don't have this one, catchphrase necessarily, but I bet it's really quick to hear somebody who's speaking in a way that sounds different and instantly flag them as being different. And of course, as we know, in many ways, our language is so changeable and it's socially motivated, and it's fascinating how it changes over the course of our lives. At the same time, many aspects of our voices reflect the voices who were speaking to us when we were children. And so in that sense, language can be used as a way to detect somebody's native group often.
Will you talk a little bit about the studies you did with bicultural, bilingual children and how they sound and who they speak, their peers versus parents?
I mean, one of the most fascinating things about language acquisition is how kids can learn to speak like their peers. And so, you can have kids, imagine a kid with immigrant parents, and they speak a language at home and then a different language at school, and they can certainly master both of them. But when they speak the school language, usually they end up sounding like the other kids at school, not like their parents when the parents are speaking the school language. And so you could imagine having, imagine as an example, you speak Spanish at home, and maybe you have 5 years of input of somebody who's a non-native speaker in English, or a whole family who's a non-native speaker in English. Then you go to school, and then you're going to sound like other kids at school. And so we did this study where we were interested in kids' social evaluations of people who spoke in different ways. And so, to give one example, we had children who were in Korean American homes, and they spoke Korean with their families, and all of their parents had moved to the US as adults, and so they were non-native speakers of English. And these kids really, they liked, on our simple behavioral test, they said they liked new people who spoke in Korean, and they liked new people who spoke in American English, and they didn't like people who spoke in Korean accented English. And so even though they're getting a tremendous amount of input in their communities, their social preferences are aligning both with their language learning and with the language of their peers.
That makes me wonder, is there anything we can do about this? Because you said earlier that we're not there yet. We don't even really talk about this. But if we did, like how successful would we be at getting kids to like all the people, not just the people who spoke Korean or American English?
We can at least do some work. And so I think that that's right, that we're not going to, imagine the hypothetical of a child who has no social boundaries based on language and thinks that, the link between language and social life is completely arbitrary. That's just never going to happen because that's not how humans work and that's not how language works. And so it makes me think of examples where people say, well, why doesn't everyone just speak English in the same way? Why don't we just cut out all this nonsense? Wouldn't that be easier? But of course, that's not how language works. So that's never going to happen. Right. Likewise, kids are always going to have social attitudes about language because they're kids and they have social attitudes and languages differ. That said, I think that children can be more open-minded, and being exposed to linguistic diversity is a form of diversity that I think is really powerful and really important for kids. And some of my work and other colleagues' work suggests that when you're in an environment where different languages are spoken, that it increases your perspective taking. I think because you're engaging in linguistic perspective taking all the time, so you're getting this practice thinking about who knows what and who speaks what to whom and in what different contexts do we speak different languages. So in that sense, I think exposure to diversity in general, but also in particular via languages is really important.
And you get an ear for these things. Like, so, I was talking actually with some people about these so-called accent reduction classes and how we never talk about, like, I was saying, why don't we have accent recognition classes? Because you just need exposure to these things and you start to have an ear for it. So, like, I'm actually really bad at listening to British English. Like, sometimes I can't really understand it, but I'm getting better at it because I watch so many Netflix shows that are, people speaking British English. But it didn't come, I wasn't just used to it automatically. I had to practice with it. So I think about those things too, that, linguistic diversity is important in that way because you can start to have an ear for these things.
And there's evidence that we have this close to home advantage, right, in accent recognition. So it's a lot easier to detect differences in accent when they're around you versus if you're an American English speaker, hearing differences among British accents is really hard, which I always think is a really nice example when people talk about linguistic biases and how people think that British accented speech sounds smart and, statusy or something. But of course, as an American, you could be listening to a voice that in Britain wouldn't be seen as high class and it sounds classy to you because, of course, you have a completely different social reference point. But I do think that being exposed to multiple languages makes you better at hearing them. Absolutely.
Yeah, John Oliver talks about this.
Yes.
How he thinks, like, he knows he does not sound posh in the UK at all, but in the US.
Oh, he doesn't. I mean, I've watched him all the time, but he...
Yeah, really... he has a hysterical segment about that, right? About how great he sounds here, but he knows that's not how he sounds to his own ear.
My British accent does not sound intellectual. Believe me, I sound like a chimney sweep passing through a wood chipper.
So you tell a story about your friend who had never even considered linguistic diversity as a thing to be concerned with. And, I mean, I don't know the answer to the first question. Do you think this is a common way to think? And then what can we do to encourage knowledge of linguistic diversity?
So, right, I do think that's a common way to think, to just not really reflect on it. And I think that these kinds of conversations are really important to start having. I hope that people, once they start to think about linguistic diversity in their own lives, they'll start to notice it everywhere, either its absence or its presence.
Yeah, it's definitely something that, I come across a lot. And it ties into something that you said earlier, too. Like, a lot of people have said to me, oh, who cares if these languages are dying? Why don't we just all speak the same language? There'll be less war. I mean, these are all obviously ridiculous things to say, but they're very common.
And I think that they reflect a lack of awareness about what language is and how it's learned and its social meaning. So, they're wrong, but they're common because of a lot of societal misunderstandings around language. I mean, another one is the idea that, I don't have an accent, but everybody else does, which of course doesn't make any sense, that everybody speaks with an accent, but it's really common for people to think that they don't, or that, that they're a really objective listener, when of course there's so much subjectivity to how we perceive things and what we understand.
Yeah, you also have to believe that there's like an objective way to pronounce any single sound, which is not. There's no such thing.
I remember being small and talking to my aunt who lives in Arkansas on the phone, and she was like, "Oh, Megan, you have such a strong accent." And I remember being very upset. Like, that's so mean. Why would you say that to me? No, you have the strong accent. Like it was something to be ashamed of. So speaking of Southern American English, can you describe your study about Southern American English, which Carrie mentioned earlier we've talked about before on the pod?
Sure. We were interested in the development of linguistic stereotypes in childhood. And of course, there's a lot of stereotypes in the US about Northern American English versus Southern American English. And as linguists, I'm sure you know that that's not just one thing, right? There's a lot of different variants in each, but cognitively, back to the social cognition, in people's minds, often they group all of the different dialect variants in the South into one kind of bucket. And people have stereotypes about Northerners and Southerners as being different kinds of people. And so when you hear a voice, you might infer something about an individual, even, of course, if you have absolutely no idea what that particular individual is like, if they are friendly or not, or smart or not, but you might think you'd know something based on their accent. So we played kids in the North and in the South voices of Northerners and Southerners. And first we asked 5- and 6-year-olds to evaluate them. These were kids in kindergarten. And we found the kids in the North liked the Northern accented speech better than the Southern accented speech, but they didn't really know much about it. It wasn't like, if you asked them, they'd say something like, "Oh, maybe they're from Australia." I mean, they had absolutely no idea. They're just like, name something that's far away, right? And the kids in the South seem to like both equally, which I think actually makes a lot of sense if you think about what they're exposed to, particularly if you consider media exposure. And as we all know, kids watch a lot of media. So then we tested a group of 9 and 10-year-old kids. So these were 4th graders in both locations. And there we found that in both places, kids thought that the Northerners sounded smarter and in charge, and the Southerners sounded nicer, which I found pretty surprising in many ways. I thought that maybe kids would endorse positive stereotypes about their own group, but not necessarily one that put the other group in a better light. So you might imagine a kid from the North saying something like, "Oh, the Northerners sound smarter, but I don't know who sounds nicer. They're equal," or something like that. But kids in both places seem to be gaining access to the same stereotypes, and they included positive things about their own way of speaking and less positive things. And so these cultural attitudes are seeping into kids, even if it's not entirely clear what the source is.
It reminds me of that study, it's an old study now, where they had black girls, I think, picking out the dolls that they liked best, and they picked the white dolls. I don't know if that would still hold true now, but whenever the study was first done, that was the case. And so, yeah, you just absorb all the whatever is in the society, no matter whether it's good or bad, about your own group.
Yeah, and you do see that. You can see that with regard to race attitudes, that it's complicated. You could have an in-group positivity, and you can also absorb racist attitudes that society has. And of course, when we think about language attitudes, you see the same thing in adults. And so, Labov and others have talked about linguistic insecurity and this idea that you can speak in a way that society considers to be non-standard, and you can feel bad about your own speech, which of course is really hard. Insofar as your speech is connected to your identity, it becomes really complicated and really disheartening.
So you also discuss anti-discrimination legal scholar Mari Matsuda, who describes how okay people are with their own linguistic bias. So this is the quote: "Listening to these and other stories, I have found that accent discrimination is commonplace, natural, and socially acceptable. People who know of my strong commitment to civil rights felt no hesitation in telling me things like, I couldn't have someone who sounds like that represent our law school, or people who talk like that sound so dumb, or my business could not survive if I had to hire people with foreign accents. And so that's the end of the quote, we as podcasters have also experienced this, like especially at the very beginning, our first episode is about vocal fry, and we had so many people tell us, oh no, vocal fry is bad, even though we were obviously like saying the opposite. So it's difficult to know what to do in this situation. What do you think we can do? All of us, but us in particular as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard, right? It's back to your question about are we, afraid to talk about linguistic diversity? And, here we are. No, we're not afraid because we don't even realize that we should try to check our biases. We're not even explicitly motivated to control our prejudice. Now, I think that when you listen to those arguments that she talks about, the idea of, well, maybe I'd understand somebody, but my customers wouldn't, something like this, that these are all the same kinds of arguments that people use to engage in race-related discrimination. And so, we have protection, we have employment protection against discrimination based on race and gender and national origin, and other factors. And the idea is that you can't be prejudiced yourself, and you also can't make hiring and firing decisions in order to cater to the prejudice of other people. And so I think it's something when we think about language that we need to be just as aware about, that we need to think, just because somebody else wouldn't like this accent, that's not a grounds to cater to that. That's prejudice. And, here what we're doing is we're saying that we're making decisions that are made with a non-prejudiced listener in mind.
Race is protected by the law, but language is not. So there's still that issue.
That's right. And I think it's an important issue to think about. Now, insofar as accent is being used as a cue to national group membership, it's protected. And so, for instance, as an employer, you can't just say, oh, well, I don't like the way you speak, and it makes me realize that you're from this country that I don't like, and so I'm not going to hire you. You can't do that. But the problem is that linguistic bias can be so much more subtle than that. And so people, if you feel that somebody isn't a good communicator and you say, oh, it's nothing against your national origin, it's just that you're not very clear in your communication, and I really need a clear communicator for this job, then at that point, a communication decision can be legal. But of course, as we know, communication is really subject to bias, and it's not just about the person producing the speech, it's also about the listener. And listeners can distort somebody's speech in their mind. They can shut down and stop listening when they don't like the way somebody's speaking. And so it requires a much more careful or fine-grained approach to really understand whether it's actually about communication or it's actually about prejudice.
So there's a nice quote from your book that's directly related to what we're talking about. So linguistic discrimination should be part of our national and judicial consciousness, and we should make an effort to curb it in our legal system and our minds. So we, with our podcast, are trying to do something on the minds front. But what can we do on the legal front, do you think?
I'm not a lawyer, admittedly.
Yeah, neither are we.
But I think that making people aware of this in their minds makes it easier for others to make the argument that this is something that could and should be changed, and that there's a number of legal cases that come up where somebody claims accent discrimination, but it's often, it has to be phrased as this national origin discrimination, because if it's just about accents, it doesn't count. It needs to fall under one of the pre-existing categories. So I do think that increased conversation and awareness about it is something that can change a national dialogue, which can then, of course, have legal or policy implications down the road.
Yeah, and that's so frustrating because national origin, I mean, we have, in the United States, someone from the South might be discriminated against, and how do we do the national origin argument?
Exactly, and you can't, right? And so that wouldn't fall into a national origin argument, but yet could be a reason that somebody is discriminated against in an employment context.
What about if it's race? So if someone is speaking with African American language, if someone hears it and they somehow manage to say the quiet part out loud, then could it be treated as a racial argument?
So I think that if it's clearly about race and it's clearly racially motivated, then it would be protected. But again, you get in these gray zones where people say that it's just about a communication issue and not about race. And of course, I think this is where you start to see these really insidious forms of racism, because it's really easy to say something like, oh, I'm not racist. I'm just, responding to someone's speech in a negative way that has nothing to do with race. And of course, it has everything to do with race.
So do you have one final thought for our listeners?
I think that we need to work towards a revolution in how we think about language in the U.S. And I really worry, given all the crises we have right now in the world and with education, that it's really easy to think of language learning as something that's kind of icing on the cake or something we do that's extra after the real important subjects are met. And I think that learning languages is critical for all of us, and it's critical for kids. It's critical for kids who just hear English at home to have the opportunity to learn a different language in school, and it's critical for kids who hear languages other than English at home to have the opportunity to learn English in schools. And so our national discourse around the importance of language learning, I hope that that's something that we can shift.
So this reminds me of a conversation that's related. In the language revitalization space, people have been worrying, are we just going to be pushed to the side? Because everyone's worried about COVID, worried about getting food on the table, and just all these basic things. But there's this article in Slate about this, about how actually there's more space in some communities for language revitalization. So it's partially just us saying, no, this is actually basic. We pretend it's extra, but it's actually basic.
And basic in the not the bad way.
No, yeah. No, we don't mean basic.
And so many schools don't start teaching foreign languages until middle school, if at all. And it's just such a wasted moment in childhood to teach kids languages when they're best able to learn them.
I know. I was in grade 5 when I first started learning French, and I think, it would have been so much better if it had been earlier.
Grade 5, that's lucky. I was in high school before I got to learn, a language other than English, so.
Well, thank you. This has been such a great conversation.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. It's really interesting speaking with you both.
And we always leave our listeners with a final message. Don't be an asshole.
Don't be an asshole.